The cherry blossoms were falling when the impossible happened. Admiral Mato Mugaki stood at his window in the Imperial General Headquarters, watching the pink petals drift past like gentle snow. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor. 6 months of victory after victory. Singapore had fallen. The Dutch East Indies were conquered. The Philippines would surrender within weeks. The Empire of Japan stretched across the Pacific like a rising tide that nothing could stop. Mugaki allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He was 52 years old, a veteran of decades of naval service, and he had helped plan the greatest military surprise in modern history. The American Pacific Fleet lay broken at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Their carriers had escaped, yes, but carriers without bases were merely floating targets. Mathematics did not lie. American bombers lacked the range to strike Japan. Their carriers could not approach within 1,000 miles without detection. The home islands were untouchable. This was not arrogance. This was simple fact. The door burst open without warning. Lieutenant Yamashita stood in the doorway, his face drained of color. His uniform was disheveled. He had clearly run through the corridors, violating every protocol of military dignity. Behind him, Mugaki could hear raised voices and the sound of running feet. "Admiral," Yamashita gasped. "Enemy aircraft. Over Tokyo." Mugaki stared at him. The words made no sense. They were sounds without meaning, like a child claiming the moon had fallen into the garden. "Impossible," Mugaki said flatly. "You are mistaken. Sir, we have confirmed reports. Multiple prefectures. Twin-engine bombers. They have already passed over the capital. They bombed the Waseda district. They are heading south toward Yokohama." And Mugaki raised his hand for silence. His mind was already racing through calculations. The nearest American carriers were tracked 2,000 miles away. Even if they had somehow approached undetected, their aircraft could not reach Tokyo and return. A one-way mission. Suicide. Americans did not do such things. They valued their lives too much. Everyone knew this, and yet the reports kept coming. Mugaki moved through the headquarters like a man walking through fog. Officers clustered around radio stations, their faces showing expressions he had never witnessed in these halls. Confusion. Disbelief. Fear. A colonel from the Army Liaison Office was shouting into a telephone, demanding to know how this happened. No one had answers. The admiral stepped outside into the spring air. The cherry blossoms continued to fall, indifferent to human affairs. And there, rising above the eastern rooftops, a column of black smoke climbed into the perfect blue sky. Real smoke. From real bombs. Dropped by real American aircraft that had somehow done what every calculation proved they could not do. Igaki's driver appeared with his staff car. The Naval Ministry, Admiral. Emergency session. The drive through Tokyo became something Igaki would never forget. Citizens stood in the streets, staring upward at empty sky. Some pointed at the smoke. Others simply stood motionless, their routines shattered by something their minds could not process. A woman clutched her child and wept. An old man sat on a bench with his head in his hands. These were people who had been told they were protected. They had been told the divine wind of the gods would never allow enemies to reach their sacred shores. They had believed, now they did not know what to believe. Igaki gripped the handle above his window as the car navigated through the chaos. His thoughts turned to the emperor. His Majesty resided in the imperial palace, less than 2 miles from where bombs had fallen. The Emperor of Japan, the living divine spirit of the nation, had been placed in danger by American aircraft that should not exist. Shame burned in Igaki's chest like acid. He was responsible for defensive calculations. He had assured his superiors that such an attack was mathematically impossible. He had been wrong. The mathematics had lied, or he had misunderstood them. Either way, the failure was his. The car pulled up to the Naval Ministry. Igaki stepped out into a scene of controlled panic. Officers rushed in every direction. Messengers sprinted between buildings. Someone was shouting orders about air raid preparations that should have been issued hours ago. Inside, Ogaki walked through corridors that had always felt like temples of power. Today they felt like tombs. Senior officers stood in small groups, speaking in low voices. No one met his eyes. Everyone was calculating blame. Everyone was wondering whose career would end today, whose honor would be sacrificed to explain the inexplicable. Ogaki entered the conference room where the emergency session would be held. Maps covered the walls. Charts showed fleet positions. Everything was precisely organized, exactly as it had been this morning, when the world still made sense. That he took his seat and waited. The Americans had done the impossible. Now Japan would have to respond, and Ogaki understood, with cold certainty settling into his bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. 300 miles away, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the news in absolute stillness. His chief of staff had delivered the report with a trembling voice. American bombers over Tokyo. Bombs falling on the capital. The emperor's safety uncertain. Yamamoto listened without moving, his face carved from stone. When the report finished, he remained silent for nearly a full minute. The officers around him barely breathed. Yamamoto was the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most brilliant naval strategist Japan had ever produced. He was also the man who had warned them. After the attack on Hawaii, when the celebrations erupted across Japan, Yamamoto had written a private letter to a friend. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve." His superiors had dismissed these words as excessive caution. Now those words hung in the air like smoke. "Prepare my aircraft," Yamamoto said quietly. "I will fly to Tokyo immediately." While Yamamoto traveled, the emergency council assembled at the Naval Ministry. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, arrived first. Then General Hajime Sugiyama, Army Chief of Staff. Cabinet ministers followed. Intelligence officers. Operations planners. The room filled with the most powerful military minds in the Empire of Japan, and every one of them was afraid. Colonel Takeo Mori stood near the back wall, clutching a leather folder against his chest. He was 41 years old, an intelligence analyst who had spent his career studying American military capabilities. 3 weeks ago, he had submitted a report flagging unusual American carrier movements in the Pacific. He had noted that the carriers Hornet and Enterprise had departed from San Francisco on an unannounced mission. He had recommended increased aerial reconnaissance of the northern Pacific approaches. His report had been dismissed. American carriers could not approach Japan undetected. This was established doctrine. Mori's concerns were noted and filed away. Now Mori held that same report in his folder, along with the dismissal memo signed by his superior officer. He was the only person in this room with documented proof that the warnings had been ignored. The question burning in his mind was simple: should he speak? The recriminations began almost immediately. Admiral Nagano demanded to know how the Army's early warning systems had failed. General Sugiyama countered that the Navy was responsible for detecting enemy carriers at sea. Voices rose. Fingers pointed. Staff officers shuffled papers and avoided making eye contact. The air grew thick with anger and fear. "Someone must answer for this," a cabinet minister declared. "The people will demand to know how this happened." The room fell into hostile silence. Everyone understood what this meant. A scapegoat would be required. Someone of sufficient rank to satisfy public anger, but not so high that the failure would reflect on true leadership. Eyes began to move, calculating, measuring. They settled on Ensign Hiroaki Tanaka. Tanaka was 23 years old, a junior signals officer who had been on duty when the first radar contacts were reported. He had followed procedure exactly. He had passed the reports up the chain of command. He had done nothing wrong. But he was young, junior, and expendable. His career could be sacrificed without damaging anyone important. Mori watched as senior officers began constructing a narrative. The ensign had failed to recognize the threat. The ensign had delayed critical communications. The ensign's incompetence had cost precious minutes. None of this was true, but truth was no longer the purpose. The purpose was to contain the damage. Tanaka sat rigid in his chair, his face pale as paper. He understood what was happening. He understood that he had no power to stop it. This was how the military worked. This was what loyalty demanded. He would accept the blame. He would sacrifice his honor. And his superiors would continue their careers unblemished. Mori's hands trembled around his folder. He could stop this. He could present his report. He could prove that the failure was systemic, that warnings had been ignored at the highest levels. He could save an innocent young man, but doing so would destroy the careers of admirals and generals. It would expose the incompetence of men who controlled his future. It would mark him as disloyal. In the Japanese military, there was no greater sin. The doors opened. Admiral Yamamoto entered the chamber. He moved slowly, his eyes sweeping across the assembled officers. The shouting stopped. The accusations died. Even the most senior admirals straightened in their seats like schoolboys caught misbehaving. Yamamoto walked to the head of the table. He did not sit. He stood there, looking at each man in turn. When his gaze reached Mori, it paused for a long moment. Then it moved on. Enough, Yamamoto said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room like thunder. We will not waste time assigning blame for the past. We will discuss what happens next. He placed his hands on the table and leaned forward. The Americans have shown us something important today. They have shown us that they will do what we believe impossible. They will sacrifice planes and pilots to strike at our heart. They will take risks we would never consider. He paused, letting the words sink in. We must respond. Not with excuses. Not with punishments. With action. Mori looked at Ensign Tanaka. The young man was still pale, still rigid. But there was something new in his eyes now. Hope. Perhaps Yamamoto's intervention would save him. Or perhaps it would only delay the inevitable. The meeting continued. Plans were discussed. Operations were proposed. But Mori could not stop thinking about the folder in his hands, and the choice he had failed to make. Outside, the sun was setting over Tokyo. Smoke still rose from the eastern districts. And somewhere in the vast Pacific, American carriers were sailing home, their impossible mission complete. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya had killed Americans before. At Pearl Harbor, he had led the first wave of fighters, shooting down enemy planes as they tried to scramble from burning airfields. He had watched the great battleships sink beneath walls of flame. He had returned to his carrier a hero. Now he stood on a Tokyo rooftop, watching smoke drift across the city, and felt nothing but shame. His squadron had scrambled within minutes of the first reports. 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, the finest aircraft in the Pacific, had roared into the sky seeking vengeance. They climbed to 20,000 feet. They searched the horizon with desperate intensity. They found nothing but empty blue sky and scattered clouds. The Americans were already gone. Itaya had studied the Zero's performance specifications 1,000 times. It could climb faster than any American fighter. It could outmaneuver anything in the sky. But today, none of that mattered. The enemy had appeared without warning, dropped their bombs, and vanished before Japan's defenders could respond. Speed and skill meant nothing if you arrived too late. The interrogations began the next morning. Military police questioned every pilot, every radar operator, every anti-aircraft gunner. How did this happen? Who was responsible? Itaya answered their questions honestly. His squadron had performed exactly as trained. The failure was not in the response. The failure was in the detection, but the investigators did not want to hear this. They wanted someone to blame. On the third day after the raid, Itaya volunteered for reconnaissance missions. He told his commanding officer that he wanted to search for the American carriers, to track them down and guide the fleet to revenge. This was partly true. But the deeper truth was simpler. He could not stand to remain in Tokyo any longer, surrounded by smoke and shame and endless questions. His third mission took him over the northern Pacific, following the route the Americans must have taken. The ocean stretched endless beneath his wings, gray and cold and empty. No carriers. No ships of any kind. The Americans had disappeared into the vastness like ghosts. Then his engine began to fail, the oil pressure dropped without warning. The engine temperature climbed. Itaia had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time before the zero would fall from the sky. He scanned his charts and found a small island, barely more than a fishing village, within range. He nursed the dying aircraft toward it, coaxing every last mile from the failing engine that he landed on a dirt strip that fishermen used for emergency supply flights. The impact was rough but survivable. Itaia climbed from the cockpit and found himself in a world completely removed from the war. The island had perhaps 50 residents. They grew vegetables. They caught fish. They had a small shrine where they prayed for good weather. Most of them had never seen an airplane up close before. They gathered around the zero with wide eyes, touching its wings like children discovering a mythical creature. An old fisherman named Goto offered Itaia food and shelter while he waited for rescue. Goto lived alone since his wife's death. His son, he explained, had worked in Tokyo. Itaia understood immediately. He said nothing. He accepted the tea Goto offered and sat in a small wooden house, listening to the wind and the distant waves. My son was near the Wazita factory, Goto said quietly. They told me he died quickly. They told me he did not suffer. He paused, staring at something invisible. They tell families many things. Itaia's throat tightened. Wazita was one of the districts hit by American bombs. He had seen the smoke rising from there, had flown over it searching for enemies who were already gone. The radio says we shot down all the American planes, Goto continued. The radio says our defenses were magnificent. But my son is still dead. And the plane still reached Tokyo. He looked at Itaia with eyes that held no anger, only exhaustion. They told us we were protected. They told us the gods would never allow enemies to reach our sacred shores. We believed them. Itaia could not respond. What could he say? He was one of the people who had made those promises. He was part of the machine that had failed this old man's son. I do not blame the Americans, Goto said. They are fighting a war. Wars have bombs. Bombs kill people. This is how it has always been. He set down his teacup. I blame the men who told us it could never happen. I blame the men who made us feel safe when we were not safe. That night, Itaia lay on a thin mattress in Goto's house, listening to the old man's breathing in the next room. He thought about his wife in Yokohama. He thought about his squadron mates. He thought about the American pilots who had flown 16 bombers over Tokyo, knowing they could never return to their carriers, knowing they would have to crash land in China or die in the attempt. What kind of men did such things? Brave men. Desperate men. Men who believed in something strongly enough to sacrifice everything for it. The rescue plane arrived the next morning. Itaia thanked Goto for his hospitality. The old fisherman nodded and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. As the rescue plane climbed over the island, Itaia looked down at the tiny village, the dirt airstrip, the crippled zero waiting to be recovered. He thought about the report he would file and the answers he would give to investigators. He thought about the truth, and whether anyone wanted to hear it. 2 weeks after the bombs fell, Admiral Yamamoto stood before the Naval General Staff with a proposal that would change the course of the war. The room was smaller than the emergency chamber where recriminations had flown. These were the men who made real decisions, away from politicians and cabinet ministers. They listened as Yamamoto outlined his vision with the precision of a surgeon describing an operation. Midway Island. A tiny atoll in the Central Pacific, barely large enough to hold an airstrip. But its position made it invaluable. From Midway, American patrol planes could monitor Japanese movements across thousands of miles. From Midway, bombers could threaten the home islands. And if Japan captured Midway, it would extend the defensive perimeter far enough that no American carrier could ever again approach undetected. The Doolittle raid proved what I have argued for months, Yamamoto said. American carriers are our greatest threat. We cannot simply wait for them to strike again. We must draw them into battle and destroy them. For months, the General Staff had resisted this plan. It was too risky. It spread Japanese forces too thin. The Americans might not take the bait. But April 18 had changed everything. The raid had proven that American carriers could strike Japan itself. The psychological impact had shaken the nation's confidence. The emperor himself had been placed in danger, the objections melted away. Midway was approved across Japan, the response to the raid took shape in ways both visible and hidden. Propaganda ministers worked through the night, crafting narratives for public consumption. The raid had caused minimal damage. American desperation was obvious. Japan's defenses had performed magnificently. 8 enemy bombers had been shot down. The rest had crashed into the sea. None of this was true. All 16 bombers had escaped. Most of their crews had survived, crash landing in China after completing their one-way mission. But truth was not the purpose of propaganda. Confidence was the purpose. Control was the purpose. Colonel Takeo Mori received his transfer orders on a gray morning that smelled of rain. Manchuria. A supply depot 300 miles from anywhere important. Not punishment, exactly. Simply removal. The men who had ignored his warnings could not afford to have him nearby, holding evidence of their failures. Mori packed his belongings in silence. His wife asked no questions. Military families learned not to ask questions. When he boarded the train north, he carried his leather folder with him. The reports were still inside, documenting the warnings that had been dismissed, the opportunities that had been missed. Perhaps someday they would matter. Perhaps someday history would want the truth. Or perhaps they would rot in a drawer until the paper crumbled to dust. Ensign Hiroaki Tanaka received his new assignment the same week. He was transferred to an escort destroyer in the South Pacific. Not the prestigious carriers. Not the battleships of the combined fleet. A small ship doing convoy protection, far from glory and promotion. That he accepted the orders without complaint. He had not been publicly blamed for the raid. Yamamoto's intervention had prevented that. But he had been marked nonetheless. His career would never recover. The senior officers who had needed a scapegoat would remember that he had almost been sacrificed. They would never trust him again. On his last night in Tokyo, Tanaka walked to the Waseda district. Rebuilding had already begun. Workers cleared rubble. Carpenters measured foundations. Life continued, as it always did after destruction. He stood for a long time, watching the activity, thinking about the American pilots who had dropped these bombs. Were they alive? Dead? Did they know what they had accomplished? They had killed civilians. They had destroyed homes. They had terrified a nation. But they had also changed the course of history. Because of them, Japan would attack Midway. Because of them, battles would be fought that might otherwise never have happened. Lieutenant Commander Itaya received his orders for the Midway operation with mixed feelings. He would lead a fighter squadron from the carrier Kaga, providing air cover for the invasion force. It was an honor. It was also a second chance to face American carriers, to redeem the failure of April 18, but something troubled him. He studied the intelligence reports carefully. American carrier strength was estimated at 2 or 3 ships. American pilot quality was rated as poor. American radar was considered primitive. The operation assumed that the enemy would be surprised, that they would react slowly, that Japanese superiority would be decisive. He had heard similar assumptions before April 18. Itaya brought his concerns to his commanding officer. The Americans surprised us once, he said. They did what we believed impossible. Perhaps we should not assume we know what they will do. His commander nodded thoughtfully. What would you have us do? Assume they are everywhere? That makes planning impossible. Itaia had no answer. The war continued. It must continue. Doubt was a luxury warriors could not afford. On the morning the fleet departed for Midway, Admiral Ugaki stood on the deck of the Yamato, watching the Japanese coastline fade into morning mist. Around him, the greatest naval force ever assembled by Japan steamed toward battle. 4 carriers. 7 battleships. Cruisers and destroyers and submarines. Nearly 200 ships carrying the fate of the Pacific War. Ugaki thought about the 16 bombers that had flown over Tokyo. They had been led by a man named Doolittle, a name that meant nothing in Japan before April 18 and would never be forgotten after. Those pilots had launched from a carrier that could not recover them, flown over enemy territory with no escort, and bombed the capital of an empire that believed itself invulnerable. They had been brave. They had been reckless. They had been willing to sacrifice everything for a gesture that might mean nothing at all, and in doing so, they had changed everything. The fleet sailed east toward Midway. Toward battle. Toward a future that no one could predict. Ugaki gripped the railing and watched the horizon. Somewhere out there, American carriers were waiting. They would do what Japan did not expect. They would take risks that seemed impossible. They would fight with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. That he understood this now. He had learned it on April 18, watching smoke rise over Tokyo. The question was whether Japan had learned it too. Or whether they would discover the answer at Midway, when it was already too late.